I'm Vanessa Joy, and this is your quick start guide to the Canon EOS R6. All right, let's get into this. Number one, I'm not gonna do a full guide going through every single menu operation. Instead, I would like this for you to be a quick start guide when you really just wanna get to know your camera a little bit, but you really don't need all of those advanced functions, at least not yet. So this is your quick start guide. I'm gonna walk you through the entire menu system and highlight the things that you probably wanna change or might wanna consider, and definitely should at least know what they do. So let's jump in. A couple of things you might want to know about your camera. The port for the HDMI, in case you're going to plug it in or need that at any point. It's not a mini, it is a micro HDMI. Not a lot of people have that cable on hand, so just heads up, micro HDMI. You got your other pretty basic ports here, your mic, your headphones, your USB, and your remote trigger. Now the dials on this baby, especially if you're used to DSLR cameras, are going to be fairly familiar. So you've got your nice thumb dial here. This is not like what each button does. It's not what I really want to do with you here, but I do want to just show it off. Your main dials are going to be here for changing settings, and here, as well as here. So when you're holding the camera, that's all easily accessible. So I tend to hold it like this. You've got your flip out screen and it rotates all around, which is definitely a lot of fun and very useful. And then of course your control dials at the top right there, which let you set your camera mode. So taking a look, you've got your play and your delete buttons here as you cycle through. You've got your info, your cue, and your zoom buttons here. On your other side, you have your menu and rate, which helps you rate the photos as you're looking through them. So this is your basic. You've also got your smart controller here. You'll find lots of uses for this. But again, I'm not going to concentrate too much on the buttons. I want to dive into the actual settings that will let you customize your camera to however you'd like to shoot. Now, before we jump into these guys, make sure that you grab my free posing inspiration guide, which you can get in the link in the description of this video. It has lots of inspiration for groups, couples, and individuals. Just grab it. Now, the first thing I want to point out is that there are two different menu screens. There's the first screen, which is just if you have it on any photo mode, which is what you see here. And the way to figure out which one you're in is, well, to one, look at the dial and make sure that you're not on video mode, just anything but video mode. Or you can look at the red number 1 menu and notice that there's only two different options that you can choose from here. If you have it on movie, you will notice that when I press menu, we have a completely different set of options. So we've got movie stuff here. I'm going to show you photo and video and how I like to keep it set up. Don't look at what's there now. That's not how I like to keep it set up necessarily, but I did want to start off by showing you that there are two different menu systems, and you want to make sure that you're in the correct one just by setting your dial to either the video function or any of the photo functions. Okay, let's go ahead and start with the photo. So number one, you've got image quality here. This is where you are determining what you want to shoot with. Now the R6 has 2 card slots. Personally, I like to shoot RAW in one card slot and JPEG in the other card slot. So that is my preference. But it really is up to you. I do recommend that you are shooting in RAW, but it is nice sometimes to just have JPEGs that you have right on your camera. You could send right to your printer or maybe upload online for safekeeping and backing up. So I like to have both RAW and JPEG set there. Okay, moving back, we have cropping and aspect ratio. Keep that at full. That is a default. You should be set there. All right, your ISO settings. I do like to go down into range, and in the minimum, go down to L. Now, you can argue all day long whether this is, better quality. It's not actually the native ISO, but it just gives you an extra little bit of range. So I like to have my L selected. So go ahead and hit OK. And then your auto speed range, that's not going to go down to low. So don't worry about that. Your auto speed range will just stay there in that range. Okay. Minimum shutter speed, you can set if you want to. I do not, so don't worry too much about that. Moving along, your white balance. I just keep it on auto white balance. Most of you who own this camera probably will do exactly the same thing. Now you can set your white balance in other ways, not in the menu system, but again, we're doing quick start, looking at all the options that you have. You have your custom white balance, which you can set. Make sure, and it comes default, that all of the white shift bracket settings are at 0. You want to do that. Now your color space, you'll probably want to stay at sRGB if you're just using this as a hobbyist, maybe budding professional, but personally I do like to shoot, for me, in Adobe RGB. It just gives you more color range in your image. If you're, again, not really a professional, you don't have to worry about it. It'll take up less space, but in a way, Adobe RGB is kind of like RAW for color. Picture style, I keep as standard unless I'm doing a shoot where I specifically know I want it really contrasty or really sharp or something along those lines, where for the most part, I keep it right there on standard. Now this clarity slider is a nice new feature with some of the cameras that Canon has come out with, like the 1DX Mark III, this R6. So it's a nice feature to have. Again, if you know that you are going to take those JPEGs maybe and export them right away, you could go down maybe -1 or -2 on the clarity. What's that going to do? The clarity is just going to make things less clear. Not necessarily less sharp, but it's actually pretty nice for sort of smoothing out skin a little bit. You don't want to overdo it and go down to -4. You don't want to do it. -1 or -2 is probably where you would want to stay. I'm actually going to set it to -1. Now this is not going to affect your RAW photos, but it is going to affect your JPEGs. And again, with your JPEGs, if you're shooting like I am with RAW and JPEG at the same time, RAW, those are the images I'm going to actually process, send to my editors. That's what I'm going to deliver to my client or have as a final image. But the JPEG, it's like a quickie. It's just there to make you happy right away. So maybe you want to right away post that JPEG on Instagram, which, you know, this camera has Wi-Fi, you can do that. Or you want to print it right away and you're not really totally concerned with it being absolutely perfect, then maybe you want to have this clarity slider slightly down, kind of smooth things out a little bit. Lens aberration correction, I would just leave that exactly as is. It's automatically on. Moving on, long exposure noise reduction. I tend to put this on auto. Just my preference. Again, you can argue whether it's going to hurt the integrity of the image. I find that I like it set to auto. High ISO noise speed reduction, I keep that at standard. You could go high, but I would prefer to do most of my noise reduction in post when I'm actually looking at the image and seeing how much I would like to reduce. And number 5, this is where you do multiple exposures, which can be a lot of fun. Number 6, and really everything after this is sort of custom modes where you probably aren't going to mess with them that much. But so this number 5 is specific for multiple exposure, focus bracketing, you know, when you plan on combining images later. Interval timer, this is just, again, not something that you're probably going to use. Interval timer is for doing time lapses. All right, I prefer, this is very important, release shutter without card. I turn that off. Why? Because if I don't have a card in here, I don't want to be taking pictures and I hear the shutter sound and I think I'm taking pictures and I am not because there's no card. So I turn that off. Very, very big. Now the shutter mode here I keep to mechanical. I like mechanical shutter, I like hearing the sound, but you could go to electronic. Electronic shutter will give you completely silent mode. So maybe you're shooting in somewhere you want to be a little bit discreet. Electronic shutter is going to be your baby. But for me, I keep it on mechanical. Image stabilization mode. So image stabilization mode, I do keep on, but the digital image stabilization I keep off. What is the difference between the two of them? The in-body image stabilization that comes in the R6 is physically stabilizing the sensor. However, digital is using digital cropping essentially to stabilize the image. So I don't want that on, I just want the in-body image stabilization on. Still photos always. So that's really all I mess with in here. All right, touch shutter, I keep it disabled. Image review. Now this is a personal preference, but I like actually 2 seconds, which is as low as it goes. I don't really want to sit there and stare at my picture on the back of my screen forever, so 2 seconds is perfectly fine. You can leave it off if you don't want it to pop up at all, but I do tend to like to pop up. Just a really nice way for me to kind of quickly see what's going on as I'm taking photos. Viewfinder review, I just keep as disabled. Everything else, metering, timer, exposure simulation, I have as enabled. Now it's exposure simulation, basically the electronic viewfinder, the EVF in here, as you change the exposure is going to show you your final photo, essentially the exposure, how dark or how light it is. Now you can take that off if, for example, you're shooting in a really dark place and you're using flash. It's not going to be able to have exposure simulation for that. So you might want to take it off so that the whole picture brightens up and you can actually see what you're photographing. But for the most part, I keep it on enable. And shooting info display, this is if you know, the type of information you want actually on the screen as you're shooting. This is pretty much how I have it set up here. And yeah, it's actually a good example. We can see how as I go through, the different settings are there. You can see a histogram here, but this is all personal preference. You can just go through and kind of look. Vertical display, if you're shooting vertically, it's very nice. Histogram display, I like it on brightness versus RGB because that's really what I'm looking at for the most part. Again, all these things are really just preference, but those settings that you see, it's exactly how I have it. Moving on to number 8, this is the viewfinder display format, whether you want the image filling the whole screen or you want a little bit of a line. I prefer filling the whole screen. Now your display performance here, this is either power saving or nice and smooth. Basically, this is an electronic viewfinder and how much you have it on is going to suck your battery because it's like having a little mini TV on. So you can have it look a little bit better or you can have it in power saving mode. Personally, I'd like to have it as smooth as possible so it's as natural to the human eye as it can be. Obviously, it's not the human eye, so anything that I can do. I do shoot weddings, so you'd think I'd want it in power saving mode, but honestly, no. I want a better user experience throughout the whole time I'm shooting. Okay, now movie quality recording. We have lots of options in here. I do not usually stay on 4K. I will go to 4K if I know I am shooting something specifically, but for the most part, I stay on full HD at 30 frames per second or 29.97p. So that is where I prefer to stay. I don't know what I'm necessarily going to film, and this camera is not one I take to weddings, so it's one that I'm hanging out with my kids. I don't need 4K with my kids. Just don't need to suck up all that memory. All right, sound recording, I typically leave to auto unless I'm doing something like I'm doing right now and I'm mic'd and I'm really trying to control the quality. Otherwise, we're just leaving it at auto. ISO speed settings, again, this is where you're setting all the max. We did this before where I set the lowest. This is where you can set the max. And for me, the max, I might as well just have it in the full range. I don't think I'll ever get this high, all the way up to 204, 800, but I also don't want to limit myself. All right, the auto slow shutter, it automatically records brighter movies when dark. I tend to keep that on. So that's all I'm setting in this Nemi. All right, moving on to autofocus. Autofocus operation, I like to keep it at servo, by the way, as you change on your lens. This changes in your menu, okay? So I like to keep this on servo because the autofocus in here is so nice and so advanced. I just want to let it do its job. I want to enable all the technology that is in this camera. So servo for me, and then I go down here, and this is something you have to enable. It doesn't just come out of the box like this. I want to have this face detection and tracking. So that is huge for me. I want my subject to detect people versus animals because I'm usually photographing people. If you are in animal photography, you would probably want to switch that to animals. Eye detection is enabled, continuous autofocus is enabled, and then movie servo autofocus I have enabled. Again, I'm enabling everything. I want the top of what the autofocus functions can do in this camera. And then my touch and drag settings, so I do enable it. This is where I'm going to take my thumb and I'm going to click and move around where I want that autofocus point to be. If it's searching, it's a great way to quickly get it where you want, or if you have multiple subjects, it's like, no, this is the eye I want, this is the face. So positioning is relative. And then my active touch area, I keep on the right-hand side because I'm typically going to go focus and use my right finger. And instead of me having to kind of do this and then stretch all the way over the whole thing, I just keep it right here and on the right-hand side, and that helps me control it much easier. So that is, for the most part, all I do in the autofocus section. The rest of this, I just keep it as it is out of box. I really don't do much with this from there. All right, moving on to the play button section. This is really more function versus setting up. So I keep this pretty much how it is. I don't do much here at all, with the exception of number 5 here. I go to the highlight alert and I enable it. This is going to turn on what I call the blinkies. And if you have an overexposed part of the dress at a wedding, which is why I turn this on, it's going to blink at you when you play back the image. So it's just a huge, hey, you're blowing this out. There's no detail in here whatsoever. Change your exposure. I like to have that on. Everything else is exactly as is. Now these are all of your connection settings. I leave these alone right out of the box until I want to connect it with something. Connect it with my phone, Camera Connect app, whatever it is. But for the most part, I also recommend actually disabling anything that you have here because it's just going to suck up battery. All right, now into our yellow menu, our little wrench here. This is where we are going to have a few things that I want to set up. Now this goes back to setting files from earlier. I go into the first one, record function. The record function, I'm going to keep the recording as separate disabled, but I'm going to go down to record options for the camera. And there I want to record separately. This is going to allow me to have one card that has all my RAW files and one card that has all my JPEG files. I like doing this because right after a job, I take all the JPEG photos and I upload them to an offline server that does not take RAW images, SmugMug. And then I have all of my RAW images on the other card. I like having them separate like that, just part of my workflow and part of my function. It's also nice if you don't want to spend a lot of money on a memory card and have to have 2 huge memory cards. You just get one huge memory card that has all of your raw data on it, and then one of like a medium to smaller size that just has all of the JPEGs on it. Just makes it a little bit less expensive when you're buying your memory. All right, everything else I keep exactly the same here. This is where you would go to format the card. I don't have a card in here, as we said before. And the auto rotate, make sure your time and date is correct. English, the rest of this, I believe I keep exactly the same. Number 5 here, I do go into copyright information, and if it's my camera, this is borrowed, I enter my name and copyright information here. It's going to put it into all of the metadata for all of your photos, so you are perfectly labeled. The rest of this, I'm definitely not changing, and I'm keeping everything right out of the box. These are all custom functions, really getting into the nitty-gritty of things that you may or may not want when you are shooting. I don't touch anything here. All right, now I am going to quickly switch this over to video, and we'll get into the video functions. For the most part, it's the same kind of thing, but let's take a look at some of the differences. Now, starting off right away in the video screen, the very first capture menu, you can see that this movie record quality did not change, even though I changed it before when we were in the photo mode. Now, this one, I have to go and change completely separately. It seems redundant, it seems kind of annoying, but truthfully what they're trying to do is let you have different settings for photos versus video. And in this case, I'm actually going to leave the actual video record quality on the video function at 4K. Because if I am recording something and taking the time to switch over into video mode, I'm probably gonna want 4K. So I am actually going to keep this shooting mode set as manual. I want to do all of my controls. Movie record quality, I am going to be at 4K at 29.97p. So right there, I am disabling high frame rate. So going back, movie cropping disabled, sound recording. I'm actually going to go right here and flip this to manual and leave it right about there. Now that's going to change depending on what it is that I'm filming, but I like to have it on manual typically when I'm recording. ISO speed settings, this is where you can go in and you can change. They do not have L for movie recording, but you can at least go to your maximum and go as high as you want. Again, I just like having it enabled as high as possible so I have all of the tech at my fingertips. Nothing else I changed there. Moving on to number 3, Canon Log settings. Keep them off. Now, if you know what you're doing and you know how to process video, then you may want to turn it on, but it is a heavier file. It does give more detail, does give more dynamic range, but keeping it off is going to give you a better looking file right out of camera, assuming that your exposure and everything is set okay. So keep that off. Now the clarity slider for video, I'm keeping in the middle right as it is. If anything, I would actually go up 1 because video is kind of hard to have in focus as it is, and it tends to look a little bit softer, so a little bit extra punch to it as far as clarity goes might be helpful for you. This I'm all leaving the same, all the same. This is if you want, to have a self timer going on. All of this I leave exactly the same and have the overheat control on, which is on automatically. In the autofocus setting, this is where you're going to want to go back in movie mode and hit autofocus method and go for face tracking. Then going back through to the exact same thing we did before. You want to detect people or animals if that's what you're shooting. Eye detection you want enabled, movie servo autofocus enabled, and the touch and drag settings I like to enable, and again relative and to the right. If you're getting into manual focus, you're going to want to control some of the things in this menu tab, but for me, all autofocus, that's what I'm keeping it on. And then this all looks good. This is exactly how I have it set. Really don't change anything in this menu. Your network settings should stay the same, so again, disabled or enable them whenever it's you want to. And the record function settings should stay the same between both menus as well. Again, your custom controls, not really messing with them here, so that is pretty much it for all of the menu settings here in the Canon EOS R6. That was definitely a lot of material, but it is a pretty quick start guide, again, to how I personally set my cameras. It's very similar across all of the Canon cameras that I have. And once you get to know the menu system, you'll easily fly through and be able to select the things that help create a better experience for you in using your camera. Again, this is a touch screen, by the way, but since I have it plugged in so that you can see it a little bit better, I have only been using the dials. Just a little note about that. So I hope this has been helpful for you, quick starting your camera experience with the Canon EOS R6. My name is Vanessa Joy. Like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell, and I'll see you next time. Bye.